All right. About ready to get started?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a new standard for Standard Oil. This is a discussion with Divest Princeton and Stephen Heinz, the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that Princeton University sits on land Pardon? Oh, sorry. If we could just mute mics, that'd be great. That Princeton University sits on land forcibly taken from the Lenni Lenape tribe. If not for this pandemic, the event would be taking place on that campus. We'd also like to acknowledge that the pandemic and the climate crises are intertwined and both exacerbate systems of oppression, particularly those that ensnare Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Divest Princeton submitted its proposal to the University Board of Trustees on February 14th.
Old coyote said when.
We submitted our proposal on February 13th, and it is currently in review by with the Resources Committee of the CPUC. This conversation is a timely one, as the committee is now moving on to the financial implications of divestment and what it would mean for Princeton's $26 billion endowment. Before we introduce our guests, I'd like to give the floor to our co-sponsors of this event, Rutgers Students for Environmental Awareness, Fossil Free Penn, Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard, and the Princeton Environmental Activism Coalition. So if any one of those representatives would want to say a few words. In no particular order.
Hi, I'm Molly.
And I'm Nolan.
We're from Students for Environmental Awareness at Rutgers University. We're really excited to be here today. We recently submitted a letter to our newly elected president, Jonathan Holloway. And in our section on divestment, we cited the Rockefeller Brothers Fund report on ethical investment. So we're excited to be here and learn more.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I can go next if that's all right. My name is Martha. I'm an organizer with Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard. We are a campaign that is pushing Harvard to disclose, divest, and reinvest its holdings in the fossil fuel industry. We are also a proud member of the Harvard Endowment Justice Coalition. So we work with the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign, Harvard Out of Occupied Palestine, and the Puerto Rican Debt Divestment Campaign, collectively for endowment justice. In April, Harvard announced that they would go greenhouse gas neutral by 2050, which is essentially meaningless. It's far too late and far too ineffective. So we're going strong, urging the university to divest, and we're happy to be here co-sponsoring this event with Divest Princeton.
All right, the floor is open for anyone else. Otherwise, okay. Well, this is a good day to be talking about divestment as well. UVM was the latest university to divest just this morning. That's on the heels of George Washington. That's on the heels of Cornell University and a whole host of others. We hope Princeton and all the other universities on this webinar will be next. But that's enough from us. We will now turn it over to our guests. So moderating the discussion today is Professor Rob Nixon. Rob Nixon holds the Barron Family Professorship in Humanities and Environment at Princeton University. He is the author of numerous books, most recently Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. Nixon writes frequently for the New York Times. His writing has also appeared in the New Yorker, The Guardian, The Nation, London Review of Books, Aeon, Truth Out, Outside, and elsewhere. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including a MacArthur Foundation SSRC Fellowship, a National Endowment of the Humanities Fellowship, and a Guggenheim. Nixon's work for the past 25 years has been focused on environmental justice, particularly in the Global South. He grew up in South Africa, left as a conscientious objector, and was active in the 1980s anti-apartheid boycott movement. Welcome, Professor Nixon. In discussion with Professor Nixon will be our guest of the evening, Stephen B. Heinz. He is the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. In 2010, he set an ambitious path to align investment of the fund's financial assets with its mission, resulting in its 2014 decision to divest from fossil fuels and establishing the RBF as a leader in the Divest Invest movement. Heinz has devoted his career to strengthening democratic culture and institutions to better serve citizens. In 2000, he co-founded Demos, a public policy organization that works to reduce political and economic inequality. In 2018, he was named by the Academy of Arts and Sciences as one of the 3 co-chairs of the National Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship in the 21st Century. On the international stage, Heinz has served as executive vice president and chief operating officer for the East-West Institute during the 1990s. Based in Prague, he helped propel civil society development, economic reform, and international security in Central and Eastern Europe's burgeoning democracies. In 2002, he led the RBF's joint initiative with the UN Association of the USA to open a Track 2 dialogue that helped lay the groundwork for the Iran nuclear deal. Heinz is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. He serves on the boards of the Quincy Institute, the David Rockefeller Fund, and the Rockefeller Archive Center. He is also the recipient of the Council on Foundation's 2018 Distinguished Service Award. Welcome, Stephen Heinz. And with that, I will depart the conversation and hand things over to Professor Rob Nixon.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And I wanted to thank Ryan and Jeremy and Aita, Divest Princeton, and all the other organizations that have gone into making this happen. And in particular, to welcome Stephen Heinz, who has played such a remarkable role in expanding and emblematically, in many ways, defining an institutional response to the divestment movement, a movement now that is the largest divestment campaign in human history in terms of its focus on corporate divestment. It includes, it's mushrooming all the time, but last time I looked, it included something like 1,100 faith, education, government, corporate, and non-profit institutions with assets in excess of $14 trillion. Many universities, as we just heard, are committing to divest on different timeframes. We're pressuring them to shrink those timeframes as the climate crisis gets more and more urgent. But I wanted to turn straight away to you, Stephen, and to ask why a fund founded in oil would take the risk of divesting. What was the thinking that went into that decision, and how has it played out for your fund?
Thank you very much, Rob. It's really great to be with all of you. I want to thank all the student leaders who are carrying on this fight on campuses around the Northeast, and obviously you have colleagues around the country who are doing the same. And your work is really, really important, and students can really make a difference. So I applaud you, I support you, and I thank you for what you're doing. So it's a pleasure for me to be with all of you this evening and to have this conversation. You know, Rob, your question is a fundamental one, and it's very interesting that when you look at the history of the Rockefeller family, you obviously start with John D. Rockefeller, who became the richest man in the world at about 1900, coming from a place where he went to work at age 16 in 1866, and he made $45 in his first year. And we know this because we have his actual ledger book where he kept all of his accounts in his own tiny hand script. So he made $45 in his first year of work, and by the turn of the century, he was the world's wealthiest person, with wealth that is actually, on a relative basis, larger than Bill Gates's wealth today. And all of this was due to the discovery of oil and his immediate entrepreneurial genius of realizing what a transformative substance this was going to be. So it is an interesting story that also from the very beginning of Rockefeller philanthropy, and after all, he started, you know, he and Andrew Carnegie in some ways really invented the modern form of American foundations around the same time in the second decade of the 20th century. And from the beginning, interestingly enough, he had an interest in the environment. It was largely an interest in conservation and beautiful natural spaces, but it was present. And his children and grandchildren really built upon that. So by the time I became president of the foundation in 2001, an interest and work on the environment had been core to the foundation's mission for many, many years. It started out, as I said, in conservation. The Rockefellers bought up a lot of beautiful land around the world, which they have donated over the years to create national parks and state parks. You know, many important places have been preserved simply because the Rockefeller family used their wealth to do so. But the fourth generation of the family, people more my age who were university students in the 60s and 70s, became much more interested in environmental science and in ecosystem management. So the RBF, as that generation came onto our board and started guiding the work, we got very much involved in managing ecosystems. And then in the 1990s, the question about the climate was beginning to be debated in research. And so the RBF was one of the earliest foundations to start funding climate research and climate public education. And then I arrived in 2001. We expanded our climate work so that by the time we were debating the question of divestment, we were spending about somewhere every year between 40 and 50% of all of our grant dollars were going for work to combat climate change in the US and around the world. And at the same time, we continue to have holdings in fossil fuels. So the original impulse was an impulse based on a sense of being hypocritical. It was a moral dilemma. It was like being a leading funder of lung cancer research and holding ownership of tobacco stocks. And we started having that discussion. And that discussion, I found a lot of sympathy on the board. Half of our board are members of the Rockefeller family, now in the fourth and fifth generations. And the other half are, you know, very distinguished leaders. And there was a lot of sympathy for the moral argument, but it wasn't conclusive. And it was when we began to really look at the economics of being a long term investor and invest in the future because of its existential threat to the planet, that we really began to join the moral and the economic and persuade the board that divestment was the right thing for us. And it was really through our grant making, because we started making grants to a wonderful research organization in London called Carbon Tracker. And they did the original, these were guys who had spent their life in investments. They worked in the City of London, the equivalent of Wall Street. They left to create this nonprofit research group. And they started doing really serious regression analysis and other financial analysis about the implications of climate change on the fossil fuel industry, and issued the first report in 2011 about the notion of stranded assets, that the ownership of these reserves of fossil fuels, the stuff in the ground, was going to lose value as the global community increased its effort to keep below 2 degrees Celsius, and hopefully the valuations of those companies and their stock was going to fall. So we were able to draw on the financial analysis, couple it with the moral argument, and that was what convinced the board in the summer of 2014 that we should make the public commitment to divest from fossil fuels, which we have done.
Great. And so I was wondering, to follow up on that, there's this question of financial risk and the issue of moral peril. And do you, so it's about 6 years, as I understand, since you divested. Over the course of those years, do you see the gap closing between the moral question and the financial question, in a sense? Because in other conversations, we hear people saying that we're on the horns of a dilemma. We know what's morally right, but financially, it's not viable. Have you seen that gap close? Have you seen those conversations shift significantly?
Yeah, we have, and I think it's we may have reached a tipping point in this regard. We are seeing that you can, in fact, divest from fossil fuels, reinvest in clean energy technologies and other impact investments that are related to sustainable development, and hit the economic or financial returns that you need to continue to support the institution's work. In our own case, we commissioned an outside study of our first 5 years of experience, and 5 years is not a terribly long time, but it's a significant enough time to get a sense of how it's going. And the answer was that during that 5-year period, a traditional performance benchmark, which we use to set our targets of what we're trying to achieve, versus what we actually achieved with divestment as the key strategy of our portfolio, we actually exceeded the benchmark by more than 100 basis points on an annual average. And that's pretty good returns in a period of market volatility of, from various sources. So in fact, we outperformed our benchmarks while we also divested from fossil fuels and reinvested in clean energy and other impact investments. So, and our endowment is only, 1.2 billion. It's not nearly the scale of Princeton's, endowment or many others, but we are at least an early proof of concept that you can do this and still achieve financial returns to support your institution. And I'm convinced that that's why, when we announced our decision in September of 2014, there were literally a couple of hundred institutions that were pledging to divest with $50 billion of assets under management. And as you said, Rob, now we're up to over 1,200 institutions and 14 trillion assets under management. And it is because people are seeing that investment in fossil fuels is a loser from an economic point of view. So I think we're really changing the discourse quite dramatically.
So, Stephen, we've talked about the financial aspect and the moral aspect, and I was wondering, particularly if we bring it into the current cultural climate, where we've got an unbelievable set of tectonic shifts that are changing the ground beneath our feet, including the ground in which the fossil fuels are embedded. Right. But if we think of Black Lives Matter, we think of the COVID pandemic, we think of one of the most consequential elections coming up in November, so consequential from a climate and a social justice point of view that people have argued that every citizen on the planet should have a vote. There's this extraordinary historic convergence. And I wondered in that context if we could talk a little bit about the power of symbolism. In other words, one of the things that's very useful about your experience is the fact that you now have a track record of the financial difference that can be made. But there is also the power of the symbolic example that may actually exceed anything that we can quantify, but can contribute to a snowballing effect or helping us reach a tipping point. And I was thinking of this in the larger context also of some conflicts over cultural symbolism that had seemed intractable. One of them, the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, the renaming of that. We've seen the commitment to renaming major sports franchises in the wake of Black Lives Matter. We've seen the toppling of monuments, honoring slaveholders and slave traders, not just in the US, but in Europe as well. And so I was wondering, in this symbolic environment, do you believe that the Rockefeller Fund has played an imaginative role in some ways that has exceeded the fiscal influence? And do you think that there are opportunities for the divestment movement to gather strength in the context of some of these social movements and these global concerns that I've just sketched out?
Yeah, I do. First of all, I agree with your starting premise. We really are at an inflection point in world history. And it is an inflection point born out of a great deal of pain. In this country, twin pandemics, one a coronavirus and the other the pandemic of enduring and brutal racism, and a leadership that is leading us in exactly the opposite direction of where we need to go. And all of these things have converged to create a moment of great energy and a moment of real possibility. And, you know, we see from the study of social change that most really profound social change occurs when there is an increase in the push from below, coupled with an expansion of receptivity above. So from the grass tops, a kind of an awareness, a kind of readiness to think about new ideas, and from below, a push for change that is based on a set of circumstances that create urgency. And we're in that kind of a moment. We are in an urgent moment. We have mass mobilization on the streets all around the world, and of course, especially in this country. And as a result, there is a lot of discussion in our political discourse about really significant change of the kind we haven't had in our political discourse for quite some time. So I do think there's reason for hope here. And I think symbols are absolutely a key part of this story. And you know, we made our announcement about divestment during Climate Week in September of 2014, when Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, organized the first UN Heads of State Summit on climate during the UN General Assembly. And on the Sunday of the weekend, 600,000 people marched through the streets of New York in a really joyous experience where they were demanding change to save the planet. And the next day we made our announcement. And at the press conference, I was asked by a journalist, well, Mr. Heinz, you know, it's very nice what you're doing, but you know, you're not that big. Your share of the global capital markets is pretty de minimis. You know, isn't this just largely a symbolic gesture? And I said, well, yes, in fact, it is a symbolic gesture, but do not discount the value of symbols. Symbols motivate, they inspire, they drive people to do things. Think of what flags have meant throughout history. Think of what the almighty dollar sign means around the world. Symbols are enormously powerful. So I really think that was the value of what we did. It had really very little to do with the size of our financial assets and withdrawing them from the fossil fuel industry. It was really about the symbolism of marrying the Rockefeller name with a statement that we can no longer be associated with fossil fuels. And you know, I have to say it really exceeded, we knew it was a symbolic act, but it really exceeded our expectations when all of a sudden, the next day we had front page stories in newspapers all around the world. We were on, you know, page 3 of the New York Times, page 1 of the Washington Post, page 3, I think, of the Wall Street Journal, page 1 of the Financial Times. A friend of mine who was a reporter called me the following day and he said, you know, I've never seen anybody get the kind of coverage you got yesterday if it wasn't a scandal. Congratulations. And it's true. And it also, you know, the symbols then started sending market signals. And even in those early days, we started getting calls from investment fund managers who said to us, you know, we saw your announcement. You turned us down for some investments a year ago because we had exposure to fossil fuels. We're now going to organize a fossil fuel-free investment fund, and would you consider investing in it? And we said, of course, we would examine it, and we did. And in 2 instances, we have invested and done quite well in those investments. So again, the symbol has its own value as a teaching moment, as an inspiration, but it also begins to send real signals that change behavior.
Great, yeah. And so I was thinking, obviously Princeton's a different type of institution, or any of the universities that are represented in this discussion are different types of institutions from the Rockefeller Fund. But you know, all of these institutions are not only in the business of protecting their endowments, but also protecting their institutional reputations. And so I was wondering if you think that we are approaching a tipping point where the reputational damage of not divesting may exceed the reputational advantages of playing it as these institutions have to date.
I do. I think we're getting there. You know, the reputational damage is going to be significant, and it already is. I mean, that's what the student movements are really posing to university administrations, because students will not want to study at places for very much longer that are contributing to the destruction of the planet. They won't want to go to work for businesses or other employers who are not concerned about their footprint on this planet. And they will not vote for candidates who continue to have their heads in the sand. So, you know, the change is upon us, and the institutions who are laggards really risk losing their reputation. And I think it's particularly acute, frankly, for universities. Universities, by their very nature, are meant to be leadership institutions. They're meant to be institutions that are committed to science, to objective discourse, of facts, of looking forward while also studying the lessons from history. And I think if for universities to be among the laggards in this process is really damaging to their reputation and standing in society.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you in terms of the recruitment and in terms of the generational differences in what the political and ethical priorities are. We're seeing a very, very significant and rapid shift across those generations. And so one of the arguments against divestment that we often encounter is that universities are not in the business of political advocacy. But when it comes to, say, some recent issues like the attempt to delimit foreign students' visas if they're not in-person classes, or we look at Title IX, university presidents get actively involved. And it would seem that this question of intergenerational injustice on a planetary existential scale is, to the students certainly I work with, the greatest existential crisis they face. And in that sense, it seems perhaps, I don't know if you agree with this, somewhat disingenuous to try to delimit advocacy that's on behalf of students, while placing off limits the most impactful of all phenomena at the moment.
I do agree with you. I think that the argument, you know, that has been articulated, you know, by most of the recalcitrant universities, my own alma mater, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, they're all using that same formulation, basically, that the endowment is not a political vehicle. But this is not a political issue. This is a moral issue. It is a planetary existential issue. And it is fundamentally important to the future of the students that these universities are educating. And to say that we're not going to get involved is to eschew responsibility in a way that I think is really seriously disturbing. You know, it doesn't mean you get every political issue or every issue that's determined to be political and all of a sudden, you know, make some adjustment, because you could spend your whole time doing that and not accomplish your other goals. But on something as fundamental and as large scale as climate change, to dismiss it as a political issue, to me, is absurd.
Thank you so much, Dean. So we're at the halfway mark, and we're going to shift now to questions that are being fed to me on the chat. And the first one is from IC, and IC asks, how do we scale up options for sustainable and socially responsible reinvestment to make a mass redirection of funds into building a more regenerative economic and energy system possible? So we're shifting somewhat from divestment to reinvestment, and what kind of affirmative structures could we put in place?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start my answer to that very good question kind of at a very high level of conceptualization. I think what we're seeing, and we've been seeing it increasingly over the last few decades, is that the way we practice capitalism globally is anachronistic. It is a method of economic management that advantages short-term thinking, wealth accumulation, shareholder primacy, and as a result has created massive economic inequality and is choking the planet with greenhouse gases. It is, we know, a core operating system of civilization as it currently exists, and it is a core operating system that is failing us, and we need to reinvent it. And I believe in some of the strengths of capitalism. I believe that private ownership has some value. I believe that incentives generate innovation. I believe that there are certain efficiencies about the market and about a capitalist approach to managing the economy. But I also believe that it is creating massive social and economic inequality and destroying the planet. And that means it's time to reinvent that core operating system in order to produce the outcomes we need, which is much greater equity, much greater social cohesion, and a planet on which we and all other forms of life can survive. And that is a big task, reinventing, reimagining what an economy needs to be, what a global economy needs to be, and how it needs to be run. So to get to the direct question, in reimagining that system, you can and must, in fact, think about incentives, ending subsidies, ending subsidies for the dirty stuff, increasing incentives and subsidies for the clean stuff, restructuring the tax system to shift investment. So it's a matter of economic incentives, it's a matter of law, it's a matter of rules and regulations, and it is all within our power to do and still have an economy that is innovative, that is driving, a reduction in poverty, which capitalism has done, that is supporting research, that is, doing the positive things that capitalism can produce while eliminating these horrific problems of inequality and planetary devastation. So we have to use all those tools. We have to use regulation and law and incentives, and we have to do a lot more public education to get the policies we need. But again, this is part of the inflection point. The fact that Joe Biden is now, put forward a climate plan, it's still not as strong as we would all like it to be, I'm sure, but it is a heck of a lot stronger than it was when Joe Biden first got into this campaign. And my guess is that the parts of it that we don't like are still up for grabs if he should succeed and be elected president. There are certain things like fracking that I suspect he feels he can't be as forward on because of the employment base in swing states like Pennsylvania, but that after he's inaugurated, we might have a better shot of getting him to change his view on fracking too. So those are the tools we need to use, all of them, all of the above.
Right, because I was actually going to just follow up on this question of fracking. I'm glad you raised that, because what we've also seen is some very rapid shifts in the viability of frack gas. We've seen the cancellation of the Atlantic pipeline, Chesapeake Energy, which at one point was the second largest frack gas company in the world. Both of them declaring bankruptcy. And so there are the shifts in terms of the infrastructure that was built to capacity that is not going to be realized or unlikely to be realized. And so there may be some sort of parallels or overlaps, I'm thinking, between the divestment movement and the fate of frack gas, which has been controversially, on the one hand, seen as a bridge to nowhere, and in other contexts, transitional, somewhat less lethal approach to energy, but at the same time, particularly in an anti-regulatory moment like under this administration, the failure to control methane and so forth has had some very, very devastating effects. So on the question of the finances of the shift from one energy regime to another, Daphne Weisham asks, thank you for this discussion. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how we can avoid having the taxpayer pick up the tab for the stranded assets of the oil and gas industry as they declare bankruptcy.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the key is that if we really do believe in a market system, the market system is based on risk, and the company takes risk. The investors in the company take risk. They take the risk because they think it prudent, and they, after all the due diligence and all the thinking it through, they feel like the reward is larger than the potential upside is larger than the potential downside. So my sense is, you guys, and they are guys mostly in the fossil fuel industry, have known for a long time the impact that your product was having on the planet. And we, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, helped fund the investigative journalism through a nonprofit journalism organization that revealed just how much ExxonMobil, from its own scientists, knew going back to the 1970s about the damage fossil fuels were having on the planet. So they've known this, and yet they continue to take the risk basically out of greed, because it was hugely profitable for a very long time. And burying the truth was a great strategy for continuing to be hugely profitable, but it was also a devastating strategy from the point of view of the impact on the planet. And so my attitude about it is, you guys took the risk. You benefited for years and years and years, not only from taking the risk, but also covering up the truth. And you know what? If you have to take the financial hit, so be it.
Thank you. So we have a question from Yashri Himatsinga. She asks, how can activists in developing countries like India leverage the global movement of climate justice and solidarity against oppression?
Yes, they're very, very important. Activists in the global south are critical to this, because as we all know, the victims of climate change are disproportionately people in the global south, people in low-income communities, Black and brown people, people in marginalized communities, people who, because of all kinds of policies that have been in place, are living in areas where they are either at high risk because of climate change itself, or living next to heavily polluting industries. They're the ones who suffer first, and they suffer the most. And so the advocacy coming from those communities has a moral force to it that is extremely important in this whole process, because, going back to something I said earlier, change won't happen without massive push from below. You need to have receptivity. You need to have an opening. Political science refers to something called the Overton window, which is an idea of thinking that, the window is only this far open, but at certain points you can push it further open to expand your range of thinking and the ideas that will be actually mainstream, as opposed to here, where the ideas in the mainstream are very narrow. And we're in one of those moments where we're pushing up the window. And that is largely the work of the advocacy community all across the globe. And the folks from the Global South have a particularly powerful moral voice in this because of the experience they're having.
Yes, I would very much agree with that. And I would add also that one of the encouraging things I do see, and we see that in the current protests in the US and globally, and I've been working in this area for probably about 25 years, I've seen a really significant shift within the environmental movement, with environmental justice moving much closer to the center. And so there was that older tradition that you alluded to, Stephen, of a sometimes anti-human environmentalism that produced conservation refugees and assumed that environmental knowledge resided in Geneva or DC or London or somewhere and was imposed or exported. And I think there's now a much wider recognition of the diverse genealogies of environmental knowledge and environmental activism that are pressing to be incorporated into the halls of power and into the arguments and discourses that shape global environmental policy. And we see this, for instance, in small island nations that are in the front line of risk of inundation and salination, banding together and forming coalitions of the like-minded and the similarly exposed. And so I am very encouraged by the diversification of the voices and the experiences, because one cannot simply testify from the center outwards. And this is true within a nation like the US or India as well, that the voices that have tended to dominate the conversation in preceding decades are now having to look at the very character of the institutions they've constructed and the moral fabric of those institutions and say, well, maybe we don't have the diversity because the values that are foundational to us are not congruent with the social and environmental priorities of the people who are now in the most pressing situations with regard to exposure and vulnerability.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the voices from the Global South and in particular the work of the small island nations and the High Ambition Coalition had a huge impact in Paris. And you know, it really, I know that a number of global leaders from the North, it was through their interaction with the delegations from some of those tiny island states and the grouping of tiny island states that had the most profound impact on them personally as they were hearing the stories. And I think that was, you know, a really important factor of why Paris ended up with an important, although inadequate, agreement. It was at least a major step forward from the previous fiasco in Copenhagen. So those voices, that experience, that reality is really quite powerful and necessary to amplify.
Thank you. So Rachel Sturley asks, where do you stand on industry partnership with research institutions, such as the collaboration between Exxon and Princeton's Anding Center? In other words, how do you respond to the argument that this crisis requires all hands on deck and therefore divestment cuts connections that some might argue to be beneficial?
Yeah, I know this is another argument that is used, and I also think it's one of the excuses that is used, and frankly, it's very, very problematic. In some ways, one could interpret it as saying that the universities don't want to give up their research grants. It's driven by the income, perhaps as much, if not more, than it's driven by the positive contribution that some of the research might make. I don't want to make a categorical statement, but I just think that these relationships need to be examined very, very closely. And I think that's another fruitful activity for students and activists, is to try to get as much information about the nature of these research relationships and to call out the ones that in fact are not contributing to solutions of climate change, but are continuing to perpetuate the use of the fossil fuels that we know are causing climate change. So I think it's very, very problematic. And I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of the major research universities are not divesting, because they are, at least to some significant degree, relying on research funding from that very industry.
Well, and the question is redolent of probably the best known divestment movement until this one, which was the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s.
Yeah.
Where you had the Reagan administration and Margaret Thatcher arguing for constructive engagement, that you change people by engaging them, as opposed to the boycott and divest movement, which was arguing for isolation. And certainly in the context of the apartheid regime, the power of isolation was both financial. They had difficulty getting bank loans and so forth, but it was also symbolic. And there was a phrase where the white regime would say, we don't want to be the skunk of the world. I don't mean to malign skunks, but that there was this fear of being ostracized that was both deeply financial but also symbolic. And so under constructive engagement, there was very little incentive for them to reform, let alone transform the structures of racism. And of course, Archbishop Desmond Tutu is somebody who has been a strong advocate of anti-apartheid divestment, and that has carried over into his passionate commitment to fossil fuel divestment as well.
Indeed. In fact, he taped a video message that that we played at the press conference when we announced the divestment decision. And it was about divest, invest in general. It was not about the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, but it was a wonderful statement drawing on the South Africa experience and how important the global boycott and divestment movement was to the transformation of South Africa and making the direct application to the climate crisis. It was wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we have another question from Corey Alperstein. Can you speak to the global investment picture right now? Fossil fuel companies are shifting their sights to export, particularly regarding frack gas, and are investing in new sources for oil in Guyana, for example. Israel is building with American oil company investors like Exxon a pipeline across to Europe to move gas from its fields to compete with Russian gas exports. Britain has caved to the US president agreeing to build LNG terminals to store frack gas coming from fracking wells in Pennsylvania, etc., and has compromised on its own commitment to end dependence on all fossil fuels, supporting the continued use of frack gas. Can we even speak of US government-driven foreign policy when multinational corporations are barely constrained and do business directly with other governments seeking to dominate the fracking industry abroad?
Yeah,
industry abroad, sorry.
Right. Well, there's a lot in that question. You know, I interpret a lot of these efforts as the last gasp. You know, the desperation of an industry that knows it is got a very short future in its current configuration, and so they're looking to every possible way to extend their life, their profitable run, rather than really looking at how they need to fundamentally transform. And I think that's what we're seeing. And they are being aided and abetted by a US government and its policies at present. Other governments are also culpable in this. And instead of providing the incentives and the support for all of that kind of activity that the question describes, we need to be doing exactly the opposite, which is providing the incentives and providing the support for the kinds of energy infrastructure investments that we know are part of the green economy of the future, which is an economy of you know, no carbon prosperity, which we can build. We can employ people, we can give people livelihoods, we can increase the quality of life, we can eliminate pollution, we can save the planet. You know, we can do these things. Human ingenuity is extraordinary. And, you know, when people talk to me about the story of John D. Rockefeller, I remind them that, you know, Rockefeller's genius was in seeing the future. He saw a substance being discovered around him and realized that it had transformative potential. At that point, as oil was being discovered, the world was lighting and heating largely by the burning of whale oil. And that was a highly inefficient process. And he saw that petroleum was going to just radically transform that. And he was right. And I would argue, based on what we know from his history and the wonderful biography written by Ron Chernow, who's more famous for his biography of Alexander Hamilton, of course, but his biography of John D. Rockefeller convinces me that if he were alive today, he'd be doing the same thing he did then, except it would be about clean energy, because he would see that's where the future is. That's where the profits are. That's where we need to go. And I want to be in the lead of that, not on the tail end. And I think that's what the smart investors and the smart policymakers and the smart companies are doing. They're getting on the front end of all of this, as opposed to waiting for somebody else to get there first.
Right, so there's both a financial and a reputational argument for leading by example, as opposed to being shamed into being a laggard.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, none of the companies that divested from South Africa are embarrassed that they did it.
Yeah.
None of them. They're proud of it. And nobody who divests from fossil fuels today is going to be embarrassed by this decision. They'll be able to face their children and grandchildren and say, well, at least I did something. I did something significant.
Yeah, well said. Jane Vosberg asks, actually it's an observation rather than a question. Fossil-free California has been trying to convince the California Teachers Fund for the last 7 years to divest from fossil fuels. They've consistently argued that engaging with fossil fuel companies is more productive. That being said, Corporate Knights research showed how the California Teachers Fund would be $6 billion better off now had they divested 10 years ago. So that's another example of what you've been talking about. Morgan Mark asks, divesting from fossil fuels is an immense first step towards mitigating the impacts of climate change, but initiatives cannot stop there. Once divestment is achieved, what are other measures that must be taken? And how can we ensure that institutions do not become complacent in rectifying climate wrongs and backpedal?
Yeah. Well, I think this gets us to the point that was also in a number of the other questions that you've asked, Rob, and that our audience has put to us. I think we need to really understand the intersectionality of all of this. We need to really see the links between fossil fuels, between persistent poverty, between racism, between misogyny, because we need a human-centered vision for the future. And all of these things impact human beings in very direct and very profound ways in their entirety, as women, as people of color, as young people. All of these things impact them through all of their ways of thinking about their own identity. And if we can think of a kind of human-centered approach to public policy for managing through these profound transitions where we have to reinvent this powerful core operating system, that will guide us to the right destination. But it's the work that needs to be done. And that's why divestment is important, but it is just one step. And we have so much more to do to create that green, flourishing economy that also reduces economic and social inequality of the future. And that's where the future we have to be.
Thank you. And Molly Pasacantendo asks, how do you respond to an institution that will not adopt early ethical investment? If the fiscal argument is made that fossil fuel portfolios will eventually do poorly in a carbon-free future, why should institutions divest now instead of waiting?
Well, because in fact they can get better returns now too, as our own case has proven. We divested and we're getting better returns than we would have if we had not divested. And I think that that's the key. That this is not. I mean, long-term investors have a bit more luxury, if I can use that term, to think longer term. But you don't have to really think long term to come to the right conclusion on this, because yes, you know, the real climate catastrophe is some decades ahead, but there is powerful climate change, life impacting climate change happening every day. And so you don't have to think long term to realize this is something we need to be doing now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm very encouraged by the emphasis on structural change that integrates an intersectional approach to the human and the environmental, the fate of the other than human or more than human inhabitants of the earth that are so vital, both to the human flourishing and also to a vision of life on earth itself.
Exactly.
And we perhaps have time for two more questions. One is from Kerry King. In terms of rapidly pursuing climate change mitigation and perhaps re-envisioning capitalism or some other basis for socioeconomic organization, I know of at least one foundation that sees the need to invest so quickly as to spend down its endowment to $0 in 15 years.
Yeah.
Would RBF consider that action? How much is maintaining the endowment as a stock of capital seeking a return, even divested from fossil fuels, maintaining a capitalist system that you say needs to change to address climate change?
Yeah. Well, the timing of that question is quite good, because in fact on Friday we will have a conversation with our board of trustees about our spending policy. And it is true that at the moment the policy set by the board is to manage our finances so that the foundation can continue to do philanthropic work more or less in perpetuity. And there are strong arguments for why that position has been the position of the board, largely around, you know, the notion that one of the only things we can probably predict with some certainty about the future is that there are going to be huge future needs. We may not know exactly what kind or what the challenges will be, but there will be profound challenges, as there have been in every century of human existence. And preserving philanthropic resources to address the needs of future generations is, in my view, a noble thing to do. But every institution makes its own judgment about that question. And in our case, it's particularly relevant because we are still, in essence, a largely family foundation. As I said, half of our board of trustees are members of the Rockefeller family. And they're in the 4th and 5th generations. So they see their stewardship today as being stewards of an extraordinary philanthropic legacy that started around 1914 and has evolved and changed and persisted all these years. It's really the only family in history that has had this kind of multi-generation significant philanthropic engagement. And so when they debate the question about spending down or increasing spending dramatically or perpetuity, they think this has been such an important part of the identity of our family, and the meaning, the purpose of our family is really all about philanthropy at this point, that they want to maintain that for the future generations of their family, in order that the family can continue to contribute to the common good in ways that have impact, which is of course what we try to do every day. So I believe in what I call diversity in philanthropy and the diversity of philanthropic models, as it were. And I think a foundation that decides it's going to spend down entirely, that's a completely legitimate and an admirable decision. But I think there's a way of thinking about perpetuity as admirable as well, especially if the resources are being used for system change, which is how we are using our resources. We are increasing our spending. Already this year, we will spend above the normal spend rate. We have just started a new $10 million racial justice initiative. We are putting another $10 million over the next few years into thinking about the reinvention of capitalism. And we have some work underway to help reinvent American democracy. So, we're using our resources, we think, in a way that is really trying to make fundamental systemic change. And, future generations will have the need to do that again. So that's the kind of calculus. But I think that every institution has to look at its values, its history, its mission, and decide what is the appropriate strategy for that institution.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. On that note, we'll round out our discussion, and thank you for your time and your insights and the arc of your experience, and all good wishes for the divestment movement as we go forward. And
thank you very much, Rob, and thank you to all the student organizers again for having me in this conversation with you. I've really enjoyed it, and the questions were great, and your work is really important, and I just congratulate you and thank you for all you're doing, and we'll stay in this fight together.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to Stephen Heinz, and thanks to everyone for coming by. If there are any questions in the chat that we didn't get to, I'll try to scrub those out. And if it's all right with Mr. Heinz, I can send them via email and maybe post them as answers to the people who asked them.
Sure.
I think there are a few stray ones in there we maybe didn't get to. The recording will be on Facebook Live for anyone that wants to re-review. Yeah, please support Divest Princeton. We're at divestprinceton.com. Please support the other organizations that are here with us today. And please support divestment wherever and whenever you can. So thank you all. Stay well and see you next time.